Please, game developers, I beg you, add more mobility mechanics to your games. So first, so that we're all on the same page, what are these mobility mechanics? Well, I consider a mobility mechanic any mechanic that allows you to traverse the game world and reach new areas. But why should we do such a thing, you may ask? Well, because they're fun and they tend to give a nice feeling of freedom to your game. Oh, that sounds good. I will add them to my game right now. But wait, not so fast. Your mechanic still has to be good. And, well, it's not that easy. But I have the solution for you. Just follow this simple rule. The mechanic has to be simple, yet complex enough. Well, that's confusing, you're probably thinking. So let me explain. The mechanic has to be simple. It should not be the main focus of the player. The mechanic should focus itself purely on traversing the terrain. And it has to be simple in the way that it has to be easy to perform. You shouldn't need specific conditions or specific locations to perform such mechanic. So a few examples. The grapple hook in the Arkham series allows you to vertically traverse the terrain, and you can perform this at almost any point, meaning that at any situation you can just look up and probably grapple hook somewhere. In comparison, the grapple hook used in most Zelda games don't allow this kind of gameplay. The grapple hook in those games is usually focused more as a puzzle mechanic or as a gate mechanic, meaning that the game will lock certain areas as long as you don't have the grapple hook item, and you can only perform the grapple hook in certain location, in certain surfaces. Therefore, this doesn't allow the traversal of terrain, it simply allows the player to reach certain areas, and specifically it allows the designers to block certain areas as long as you haven't reached the point where you unlock the grapple hook. And for example, the gliders in Far Cry 2, and some of them in Far Cry 3 and in Firefall and old MMO games. In Far Cry 2, you can only use gliders when you find them, and you only find them in specific locations, meaning that you can only glide if you are at the specific location and use the glider. In Firefall, for example, you can only glide when using certain jump pads. You find certain jump pads in the world, and that propels you up, and then you start gliding. But you cannot just jump off a cliff and start gliding. And good examples of how gliding is used is, for example, well, again, the Arkham series or Breath of the Wild and some other Zelda games. In these games, you can simply use it at any point. As long as you're flying, you can deploy the glider and start flying. So now for the second part of the rule. The game mechanic has to be complex enough. So what do I mean by this? I mean that it has to have some level of complexity, meaning that the player shouldn't be able to perform it perfectly the first time he uses it. It should require some learning, and it has to be complex enough to allow it to be very satisfying when actually done correctly. So for some example, we've got flying in most MMOs and flying mounts. In those games, you usually use an item, which is your mount, and then you can simply fly. Wherever you're pointing out, you will just fly directly to it. This is too simple, and although it might be fun at the beginning, it might get old pretty fast, and you end up just using it as a time saving mechanic and not necessarily because the mechanic itself is fun. In comparison, again, if we talk how Breath of the Wild does it or how Far Cry does it, so Far Cry, although the mechanic is quite simple, it's still complex enough to the point where the first time you use it, you're probably going to die. You might not know exactly how to use it, you might dive in too fast, you might end up against the ground too fast and die. In Breath of the Wild, although you're probably not going to die unless you run out of stamina, you might not use it properly and not be able to reach the place you were aiming for. So then you could go back and think, Well, you talked before about the grapple hook in Arkham, and the grapple hook in Arkham would be, in and of itself, as a mechanic that is very simple. You simply have to point yourself towards something, click a button, and there you go. You're grappling to the place you want it to go. But what makes the Arkham series mobility mechanics fun is the combination of many smaller mechanics. So here, the complexity would not come from the mechanic itself, but it would come from its combination of many smaller mechanics. In the Arkham series, you have the grapple hook, the gliding, and then you have the special grapple hook that you can then propose yourself further when gliding. So then what makes it fun in the Arkham series is not necessarily the mechanics themselves being complex, but the combination of them, and here's where the complexity comes from. On the other hand, you have certain games that add other layers to these mechanics that make it slightly more fun. So for example, when you look at the swinging from the Spider-Man series, the mechanic in and of itself is not too complex either. But these mechanics, these games, usually couple the mechanic with a lot of animation work that end up making the game and the mechanic itself very fun to play with and very fun to look at because of how good it looks and how satisfying it is to see the character perform all these acrobatics. And other games have other ways of doing this, and not necessarily with animation, but for example, with music and soundtrack. And I did mention like flying mounts as a bad thing, as a bad mechanic for the most part. But for example, Flife, it added a very good soundtrack that only played when you started flying. And that soundtrack, it's so good that makes the flying a lot better. Other games that do this, for example, are the Wind Waker. So the Wind Waker has this boat mechanic that allows you to just travel through to the different islands, travel through the sea. This game also has a soundtrack that once you are actually cruising through the sea, that starts playing, and it is again a kind of like a reward to the use of the mechanic, and it makes it a lot better. But additionally, the Wind Waker also has something that I really like, and not many games do it, which is that because you'll spend most of the time going in a straight line with the boat, the game adds mini games that spawn in front of you when you're playing that makes you change direction slightly. It will spawn, for example, 3 barrels in front of you, and each of these barrels will have a different amount of rupees on top of it. So then you'll have to slightly direct your boat to get to the barrel that has the most rupees. Or all the mini games could be that it will spawn some rupees in the air, so then you actually have to jump with the boat to get those rupees. So it makes you stay focused on the game, even though you are technically going in a straight line and probably nothing is going to happen. So then, when talking about boats, I also think about the recent game Valheim. In Valheim, you can use boats to traverse the world, which is your main mode of transport, pretty much. So the boats in Valheim are a good example of a good amount of complexity. So the boats are not hard to drive, but they're not extremely easy either. You have to learn how it works a little bit. Then, of course, you have to pay attention to the wind. Then, something that is quite funny about the mechanic is that in real life, when sailing, if you have the wind against you, what the sailors will do is actually start zigzagging to catch the wind on the side and then go faster that way, right? And in Valheim, you will naturally, because of the way it is and because of the small indicator that tells you when the sails will actually catch the wind, you'll end up doing that naturally, which is kind of funny. So to conclude, I'm giving you this formula: make the mobility mechanics simple yet complex enough so that it allows for satisfaction on the player when done correctly. I would also always recommend that whenever you're making one of these mechanics, you make sure that the mechanic in and of itself is fun as well. And obviously, you have these tricks that I mentioned that you can couple this mechanic with a nice soundtrack, with some nice animations to that. Although the mechanic might not be too complex, it will make the mechanic more satisfying and more fun to use. So, thanks for watching. Hopefully I motivated you to make more mobility mechanics in your games. And I'm looking forward to seeing more of these in the future. Thanks for watching and see you next time.
I'm gonna tell you a little story about a boy named Joe.